Whatever ultimate reality is, whatever is prime in the universe, whether it's material or immaterial, natural or supernatural, has inescapable implications for the rest of reality. Human rights, causation, the nature of justice, whether or not you have free will, whether or not people are valuable all by themselves, or if they're means to some other ends, the comprehensibility of nature and the reliability of your rational faculties. The most basic presuppositions that we have about our ordinary lives hang tenuously on whether or not God actually exists. For the thinking man or woman, questions about the nature and existence of God simply cannot be ignored. For the last 150 years or so, atheism, or at least a generalized skepticism towards theism, has been the default position of most thinking men and women. For some, it was born out of a careful consideration of the arguments and the evidence for and against God. But I would say for the vast majority, it was simply an assumption that you were only going to believe what was real and you were going to reject fairy tales and myths and anything that it had a general sense of hokum to it. And because for those same people, God seemed to have that same quality, they simply rejected him without ever considering, one, the arguments or evidence for his existence, or two, without really weighing the intellectual consequences of that decision. But without considering those implications, what it left these intellectuals with was a handful of assumptions that were simply anchorless in reality. Now, some atheist philosophers have really wrestled with and grasped the gravity of rejecting God, and they've written and published lots of work on it. Unfortunately, those implications have not been grasped fully by the wide breadth of intellectual and naturalistic thinkers. This has resulted in so many philosophers and doctors and psychologists and sociologists and academics and political commentators, etc., having rejected God from their worldview, but not genuinely understanding the intellectual ramifications of reordering their understanding of reality. Throughout the last 2,500 years of philosophical history, thinkers from literally Aristotle to Aquinas to contemporary philosophers like Richard Swinburne have put together arguments for God's existence. And these are normally phrased in terms of a syllogism. Now, all the most famous arguments for God's existence are logically sound. They're sound deductive arguments. What that means is not that they're necessarily true or that they prove God's existence. What that statement means is that in order for them to not prove God's existence, there has to be a flaw in one of the premises. Now, as there have been many great atheist philosophers and thinkers throughout the generations, they have obviously contended with these arguments. And in studying the best, not your random village atheist, but the best atheistic responses to these arguments, what I have found is that to deny the premises in these arguments requires what I consider to be an unaffordable intellectual cost. To put it another way, to be an intellectually consistent atheist requires you to adopt certain ideas that are so much more outlandish and irrational than simply accepting the fact that God actually exists. One of the more popular arguments for God's existence is from morality. We can date this argument certainly back to at least Aquinas, maybe even before him. C.S. Lewis has a very famous version of this argument as well. But in my estimation, what's actually more important than the great Christian thinkers who afforded these arguments are actually the atheists, because they have supplied and supported the premises for this argument over and over and over again. The argument typically goes something like this: that God is the only possible objective standard for moral values, duties, obligations, that sort of a thing. What follows from that? That if God does not exist, then there could be no such thing as moral obligation, moral value, moral duty. You couldn't have human rights. And then the second premise would be something like, those things do exist. We know that humans actually have rights. Every time you assert your right or somebody else's right in the political sphere, you are affirming that you believe the second premise, that morals, moral value, moral duty actually exists. But from the first two premises, what follows inescapably is that God therefore must exist. So how would atheists respond to the first premise? Like I mentioned earlier, the highest brow, the most credible atheist thinkers from very, very, very different schools of philosophy and intelligentsia and academia affirmed this first premise. So you have Nietzsche, who is an existentialist, you have the postmodernists like Michel Foucault, and you even got the positivists like Bertrand Russell, all saying basically the same thing. If there's no God, there's no lawgiver, there's no moral arbiter, there's no judge who would make the discernment as to who is right and who is wrong when it comes to what is right and wrong. See, if God does not exist, then all we are the byproducts of time and chance, of the evolutionary process. And that means that we are by definition an accident. Accidents have no intention behind them. So if there's no God, there's no mind that wanted us, that intended for us to be here. If there's no intention, then that means that there is no meaning, because meaning comes from intention. There's no design, because again, design comes from a mind that intends for something to be a certain way. See, the mind has a thought that something should be a certain way, and that's called your design. But if there's no design, then there's no should. You can't say that humanity should behave this way or that way. You can only say humanity does behave this way and that way. In philosophy, we call this the fact-value distinction, or David Hume's famous is-ought. The Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy puts it like this: that people obey the law, or act honestly, or value money is one thing. That they should is obviously quite another. This is what led the very famous evolutionary biologist and atheist thinker Richard Dawkins to say this: in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, others are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties you should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, and what's the implication of that? Follow? No evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. You may say then, what of my moral intuitions? I feel that some things are truly right and wrong. Some things should never be done and some things should frequently be done. Again, if there's no God, then the only explanation for this would be the evolutionary process. These values, traits, beliefs, and behaviors simply came about because they provided our species some sort of survival benefit. Of course, that would imply that if we evolved from a species where forcible copulation and, say, social domination provided them a survival benefit, then we just would have evolved with a sense of morality that either allowed for or actually encouraged things like rape and patricide and oppression. In fact, it actually goes a good bit further than that. It's not simply that had our ancestors survived that way, then we would today possess these. It's that if in the future that social conditions or physical conditions arise in such a way to where those types of what we now consider evil behaviors do in fact promote the propagation of the species, then we should expect the human race to develop and grow into that type of a moral system instead of what we have today. Again, to quote Dawkins, DNA neither cares nor knows, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So for a lot of these thinkers, they're consistent intellectually enough to say there's no God, which means there's no moral arbiter, which means there's no law for us to actually, that we actually have to obey. But for many atheists, that's a bridge too far. They can't deny the second premise. They think, no, if I know anything, I know that there's certain things that are right and wrong. I know that the Holocaust was evil. I know that Hitler was not a morally neutral person. He was a morally evil person. I know that MLK is a morally good person, right? And so because of their commitment to the objectivity of right and wrong, then they look for an objective basis for morality outside of God. Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty are two of the more famous kind of atheist popularizers. And they both have attempted to show that you don't need God to have objective morality. And they say all you have to realize is that human flourishing is, or human well-being, is equivalent to what is good. Now, this is demonstrably false if you accept an atheistic worldview for at least two different reasons. First, there's no scientific definition. Science won't tell you what human flourishing looks like. Is it overall happiness by the most amount of people? Is it the propagation of the species? Is it sustainability and stability in our political structures? You could say maybe it's all three, but these commonly come into conflict with one another. And it has all the shortcomings of a basic utilitarian ethic, which would, if you're not aware of, would justify all sorts of atrocities because it would lead to the greater flourishing of the most people. The second problem, and far more fundamental, is the problem that it's completely and utterly arbitrary. The atheist thinker Steven Pinker points this out. We are simply accepting the flourishing of the human species because we're humans, which he likens to chauvinism or racism. It's just in-group, out-group morality. I'm this, I'm in this group, therefore the flourishing of this group is good. That's not in my group, so its flourishing doesn't really matter to me. But again, on atheism, why should I care about human propagation or human flourishing over, say, bacterial propagation or bacterial flourishing? Why should I care about over plant or animal flourishing? Why should I chop down a tree, which is alive, to build my house? And why should I wipe out a few billion bacteria that are inside my body using it as a host? Why am I putting my life over their lives? Except that I'm just arbitrarily assuming that this spin-off of evolution is more important and more valuable than that spin-off of evolution. Without a God to justify this, to say that humans are made in his image, then there is no objective basis for delineating between these things. It's arbitrary, and therefore it fails to account for objective moral values and duties. Now, you may be asking, okay, well, if Steven Pinker sees that, how does he deal with this problem? And the answer is inconsistently, but we'll get to that here in a second. He tries to find a different moral basis, a different objective moral basis. So he says it can't simply be based on our humanity, because that's just in-group, out-group thinking on atheism. So what is it? He says, drawing from the work of philosophers like Michael Tooley, he says that certain humans, possess certain morally significant traits. These would be things like self-consciousness, self-reflection, plans for the future, an intentional choice not to die. But we actually have the same problem with this approach that we did for the other one. We're simply identifying what we have with what is good. So we have sentience, but why? Why would I value sentience or self-consciousness over brute strength or physical size or mass? Or how about length of life? Trees can live to be hundreds of years old, right? Why am I picking these specific traits and then calling them morally significant? It's the same thing that Sam Harris did. I'm arbitrarily picking my group as more important than another group. The second problem with this is that it leads to what are truly iniquitous conclusions. Both Michael Tooley and Steven Pinker use this line of thinking to justify to justify the killing of people who don't possess these traits. They both defend neonatal infanticide, and they say that it should not be considered murder. That's insane, or at least we should consider it to be. Now, I did mention that he is a relatively inconsistent thinker. While he will use words like should and should not in different contexts, he seems to adopt the rejectionist view, or the atheistic biological view of this, that in the end, what we consider to be moral is just a matter of brain chemistry, and therefore is actually just subjective. It's not objective. And he even goes so far, and I appreciate his consistency, he goes so far as to admit that this implies that atrocities like genocide and slavery, and he names them, aren't actually objectively evil. They're simply just distasteful. So let's review the intellectual cost of atheism. One, you can accept the in-group, out-group morality of Harris and Dillahunty and simply pay the intellectual cost of having no justification for that moral assertion. Two, you can pay the intellectual cost of simply saying that no, these things aren't actually evil. Rape and incest and murder and theft and fill in the blank, child abuse, that none of these are actually objectively wrong. I just don't like them, and that's the end of it. That both of those seem to me to be too high in intellectual cost, so you can accept the third option. God simply exists. Now, this video is not intended to argue for God's existence. It's simply to help you understand the intellectual cost of atheism. But at the end of each of the four things I want to discuss, I'll give a short case as to why God actually does explain these things. He's not simply the only other option, though he is, but he also is the best option. He makes a lot of sense of what we see in the world. So let's take morality now. I think that human flourishing actually is an objective standard, but that's because humans themselves are inherently valuable. Now, why are they inherently valuable? Well, in order to make a delineation or distinction that draws apart humans from the rest of the primate kingdom and all the rest of the species of living things, you would need a mind to make this assertion. There's a mind required to make this delineation. And this mind would therefore be the thing that gives humans its value. It establishes value. And this would also be the thing that this mind would be the thing that establishes moral order and moral rights and wrongs. And so you have something like a lawgiver, right? Which is a traditional way of saying God. And because moral laws are necessary in their existence, that justice can't be the opposite of justice. That's injustice. Justice has to be what it is. It cannot change because it's necessary. This mind itself also must be necessary. A necessarily existing moral mind or person is just what we mean when we say God. Okay, now let's move on. Try to explain free will or explain your mind or explain your thoughts without appealing to something immaterial like a soul. Let's take free will first. This one's pretty fun. Sam Harris was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about this, and it's a YouTube video. You can go look it up right now, called Taking the Red Pill on Free Will. And in this video, he discusses that because we are only material, what we are is just our brains. We are just the byproducts of electrons flowing through our gray matter. That this means that free will is an illusion because our beliefs, our thoughts, our actions, they are causally determined based on the laws of physics, chemistry, biology. It's the things that are happening here that are causing all of this. My words that I'm speaking through this microphone to you are causally determined by the scientific processes going on inside my skull. I am not in charge of my brain is in charge of me. Now he realizes and recognizes and explains that what this means is that we are now we're not responsible for our own actions. I'm not responsible for my actions, my brain is. And because of that, he uses, and I'm going to use his exact analogies, he says we should view terrorism and a hurricane with the same sort of emotional distance, that we're not angry at the hurricane when it blows through. And so when Al-Qaeda bombs us, which is his exact example, we should feel pretty much the same way. Now, if we could kill the hurricane to keep ourselves safe, that's fine. We would. And so it's fine to kill Al-Qaeda or to fight terrorism or a bad guy who's coming to, destroy your house or whatever. But it's not because you shouldn't feel angry at them because this agent has come to do you harm. No, that's just a brain doing what that brain does, caused by culture and chemistry. Similarly, he talks about retributive justice and this idea that when somebody, say, is a mass murderer or is somebody is a serial killer, they didn't do those things because they were sadistic or evil. Of course not. Rather, what do they do it for? Well, it's because their brain is causing them, it's fizzing in such a way that it's causing them to go do these things. And he says, thinking of punishing them for their crimes is the same as punishing an animal for its crimes. And he brings up this really strange case of an elephant who is literally hung for trampling its owner. The problem in all of these four examples is a misattribution of agency. Here's the point. You are not an agent. You don't make decisions. You picked green jello instead of red jello, not because you could, but because your brain made you. Likewise, Hitler in The Final Solution were not literally his evil inclination and racism being born out. No, it was just brain chemistry and culture, again, causing him to do these things. Now, why should we think he's wrong? I'm going to go back to somebody who I think is constantly misrepresented, who is Descartes. He said, I think, therefore I am. And you have to understand what he was talking about whenever he said that. Descartes was asking himself, can I be literally skeptical of everything? Can I be skeptical that the world exists? Of course. Maybe some sort of evil genie has bewitched my mind to think that this whole world exists, but it doesn't really. Then he went even further. Can I doubt that I exist? Which is exactly what Sam Harris is proposing, that you don't actually exist. He says in this analogy that, could the genie convince me that I exist when I don't? And he realizes what is an actually self-evident belief, that in that moment, he would have to be convincing a thing that is able to be convinced, that's able to think, and therefore, I would still exist. I'm a thing that exists, that thinks. That's me. That's what I am. And so you can convince me that the whole world is really a video game, or that I'm just a brain in a vat being stimulated by a scientist. But what you cannot convince me of, because it's self-evidently false, is that I don't exist. I think. Therefore, I am. Beyond that, I have the experience of actually making choices. I have chosen things, you have chosen things. And so when somebody comes along and says, you don't have free will, and you can say, yeah, I do, because I just used it to not smack you in the face, that is an immediate evidential response to this idea. Further, we actually have scientific data to back this up. Now, we wouldn't need scientific data because we have our experience, and experience is the primary way you know 90% of what you know. You know that your phone exists because you're looking right at it. You know I exist because you're looking at a picture of me. It's your visual and your auditory senses that are telling you that this is real. Now, if that experience can tell you that the external world is real, then your experience of yourself and your experience of choice is enough. But let's go with the hard data too. There have been study after study after study in the arena of cognitive behavioral therapy, which shows that your intentions, your choices will literally rewrite your neural pathways. That you have the ability through gratitude and a handful of other practices, even to the degree of decreasing OCD symptoms, you can change and reroute these pathways, which would mean that you, though you're influenced by your brain, are in some sense distinct from it. Now, what would it mean that you are distinct from the part of your body that thinks? Well, it would mean that your mind is not entirely identical with your brain. Now let's move on to Alex Rosenberg. He is delightful because he brings us to its absolute most absurd conclusion, but I think it's logically inescapable. Once you reduce the person down to their brain, then you realize that the person is physical. You are a physical thing, which means that if I cannot predicate something of a physical object, I can't predicate it of you. Okay, to say another way, if something cannot be true of a physical thing, then it cannot be true of you or of your products. Now, what does that imply? Physical things are not about anything. They're not about something. This microphone isn't about a thing. My coffee mug is not. The desk is not. My hand is not about anything. What is about things? Well, thoughts. Thoughts are about things. But thoughts are not, but aboutness doesn't apply to physical things. So Rosenberg has the audacity to say that naturalism implies you're just your brain, you're just physical thoughts, therefore, and physical things can't be about anything. Therefore, your thoughts aren't actually about anything. You're not thinking about anything. Of course, you know that you're thinking about my words right now, but for Rosenberg, naturalism obviously and inescapably implies you can't think about anything. And therefore, instead of just saying, well, the naturalism is wrong, he says, sure, then I can't think about anything. In his book, he says the book isn't about anything. Physical things don't have meaning. Meaning, again, is a part of a mind, and it's about sentences. And therefore, he goes so far as to say that because naturalism is true, the sentences in his book don't have any meaning. And lastly, physical things, he has about 7 of these, but he says physical things can't be true, right? My mug isn't true, only a sentence or a proposition is true. That's an immaterial thing. But he's a materialist. Nothing exists that isn't material. Therefore, nothing is true, including the words in his book, which have no meaning and aren't about anything. So again, naturalism has some intellectual costs. Let's refresh them. If you believe in naturalism or materialism, which they're slightly distinct, but for right now, they're close enough to just lump together. If you accept this, then you have no free will, which would imply that the physical forces that cause, say, a hurricane are similar, if not identical, to what cause murder, and you should feel emotionally the same way about either one of them. You have to accept that your mind doesn't actually exist, that you don't actually exist, you're not an agent. You have to accept that your thoughts aren't about anything, they're not true, and they have no meaning. Or, and hear me out here, you can realize that those are the absurd conclusions of materialism and reject them, and therefore reject materialism, and accept that reality possesses immaterial objects. Now, again, that would leave God, I think, as the only possible candidate, but let's just make sure we know that he's a really good candidate given what we know. We are immaterial minds that have physical, we have causal powers over the physical world. Therefore, it's not at all absurd to assume that there is another, larger, more fantastic, maybe even necessary mind, immaterial mind, that has causal power over the physical universe. All right, let's move on to the fine-tuning of the universe. Over the last 100 years or so, physicists have discovered that for the universe to operate in any sort of complicated way, for it to be anything more than essentially one massive black hole or just a dark, diffuse, ever-expanding space full of nothing but elementary particles, in order for it to have complex motion, chemistry, that sort of a thing, there are certain parameters that have to be met. These parameters are things like having laws of nature, which laws we have, the strength of the constants that are embedded in those laws, the quantities of certain types of matter and antimatter and entropy that we have at the initial conditions of creation. And what they found about these parameters is that they're unbelievably narrow. And when I say that, most people don't have a genuine sense as to what I'm talking about. Scientists discuss these numbers in terms of being unimaginable. You literally cannot understand how exceedingly narrow these types of things are. If I were to flip heads and tails and try to go for heads 5 times, It should take me about 32 trials before I get heads 5 times in a row. That's rare, but it's nothing like what we're talking about. If gravity were any stronger or weaker by, say, 1 part into the 10 to the 60th, that's a million, then all of the universe would either expand so rapidly as to make the coalescing of galaxies and therefore stars and therefore the creation of heavier elements to form planets and things like that, and then eventually leading to life. None of that would happen. You wouldn't have galaxies, you wouldn't have nebula, you'd have nothing. If it was a little bit weaker, we would expand out, the universe itself would expand out to the point where you'd have nothing but space and elementary particles. If it were any stronger, everything would coalesce together and into one massive black hole. And that's assuming that you actually have a law like gravity. Similar things can be said about the speed of light, the mass of the proton, the mass of the neutron, the strength of the electromagnetic force. So whenever you multiply these odds together, you're looking at winning the lottery hundreds of times. This is such a substantial challenge to sort of the classic way of thinking about the world that you even have atheists admitting that this is a really strong case for the existence of something like a supernatural designer of the universe.
Certainly we're all asked, well, which is the best argument you've yet come up against from the other side? I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one as the most intriguing.
The Goldilocks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Fine-tuning the 1 degree, one hair different to nothing. But even though it doesn't prove a designer could all have happened without it. You have to spend time thinking about it, working on it. It's not a trivial. We all say that.
When you come on later to the origin of the physical constants, now that's getting warm. That's getting close to a good argument. The physical constants. Things like the speed of light, gravitational constant, and strong and weak force and things. Most physicists agree, that if you change any of those constants by even a very, very small amount, then we don't come into existence. The universe doesn't come into existence. They have to be like that in order for galaxies to form, for stars to form, for chemistry to form, actually. And then for the prerequisite for life to evolve, needs that as well.
So then how do these credible atheists actually respond? I'll let Richard Dawkins speak for himself.
Even for someone like you, Richard, you'd say that if there were an argument, it might be this one. And actually, I've heard many other atheists say that. Peter Millikan, I think Hitchens, all said, okay, that might be the one if you were going to, crack the door open a little bit. But I think what you were coming to, Richard, is why you still think this is, you're still essentially pointing to a gap and filling it with God. Is that
because it seems to me all you're doing is pushing it back a stage, and you've still got to explain God. Right. You're saying we need an explanation for the fine tuning, and so we postulate a fine tuner. But you haven't explained anything.
Now, I hope you can see that that's a really, really, really bad argument. If I were to come across something like, chiseled arrowheads and pottery shards in the ground, I wouldn't have to know what people group that is. I wouldn't have to know where they came from. I wouldn't have to know the nature and origin of humans, right, in order to understand that that was a product of some sort of primitive tribe. Further, he says this.
But also, yes. You might convince somebody like me to be a deist, but then you suddenly say, okay, well, because of...
he's converted. Did you hear that?
Here. because of the fine-tuning argument. But then suddenly, okay, then we get Jesus Christ, and then we get crucifixion, then we get resurrection, we get virgin birth. That's nothing to do with it. I mean, that's a positively dishonest way of smuggling in what you really want. Well, not you, but I mean what some Christians really want, which is to bring in Jesus or Allah and Muhammad or Buddha, whatever it is. You cannot do that. I mean, you've got either you're going to stick with a fine-tuning argument, which is a good argument, or you've got to produce a really good argument for Jesus. But don't think that because you've convinced somebody by the fine-tuning argument to be a deist, that therefore he's then got to believe in Jesus.
I really don't even know how somebody with such clout can say something so utterly asinine. That's like saying, you may have just proven there's a designer to the universe who is beyond all of space and time, who is immensely powerful and has creative power over the known universe, effectively ruling out atheism and agnosticism and every religion that posits a God inside the universe, like polytheism and pantheism, leaving only 3 or 4 religions left. But that's still a bad argument. Of course, it's not a bad argument. It's a fantastic argument. It just doesn't prove literally everything. If I were to find some DNA at a murder scene, conclusively proving that the murderer was a man, that he was blonde, he had blue eyes, that to say that this is bad evidence because it doesn't tell me his exact name is insane. It's asinine. So that's literally the same thing he's just said here. I'm thankful that he's willing to point out that, yes, this doesn't talk about his listening to prayers. It doesn't prove that his name is Jesus or that he was incarnated and died for our sins. But it rules out most other religions and worldviews. And it takes you to a place of saying, okay, then which of the possible theological options is actually true? Now, many people try to avoid this by appealing to the multiverse, which I think is, there's this internet rule. The first person who calls somebody a Nazi in an internet debate loses the debate. I think whoever appeals to the multiverse to explain away the insane chances of the fine-tuning of the universe basically has just said they're wrong. Why is that? You're appealing to having infinite chances. They're saying if we had infinite chances, then it wouldn't matter that the chances of this particular universe are so extravagantly, insanely unlikely, because we have enough chances to eventually pop out a universe like this. But that would ruin all probability judgments for everything. Let me explain. Your chances of getting a royal flush, I think if you were to play 20 hands a night, I believe, it would take you 83 years to get one royal flush, maybe even to see it. All right. Now, that said, what if for 6 years in a row, the winner of the World Series of Poker won by royal flush? And the answer they gave was, no, it's not that I'm cheating. It's not that I've rigged the system at all. It's not that there's design at play in this system. Rather, it's simply that in the infinite infinite ensemble of universes that are randomly constructed, there just had to be one in which somebody won the World Series of Poker 6 times in a row with a royal flush. You would never accept that type of thinking or that justification for the royal flush thing. And that's significantly more likely to happen than this universe, which is why the fine-tuning has led many physicists to believe in either deism or theism or full-blown religion. Let me give you a couple of quotes from astronomer Edward Robert Harrison. He says, the fine-tuning of the universe provides prima facie, that means at face value, prima facie evidence of deistic design. Physicist Paul Davies says, there is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers. The impression of design is overwhelming. And this is probably the most forcefully stated one. This is by astronomer Fred Hoyle, who was an ardent atheist for most of his life. He says this, a common sense interpretation, I love that phrase, common sense. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect, i.e. God, has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion beyond question. So to sum up the intellectual cost of explaining the fine-tuning of the universe via naturalism, atheism, materialism, is you'd have to accept that this universe got so unbelievably lucky that it defies all of what we know of chance and probability, or you can accept that there are infinite choices and therefore destroy any chance of ever rejecting an outcome based on its improbability ever again. Or you can go with what Fred Hoyle calls the common sense interpretation, what seems to him to be beyond question, except that there's a designer to the universe. Now, why should we think that this cause or this designer is in fact something like what we call God? Well, it would be beyond the space-time universe, so immaterial and spaceless, and therefore, and is intelligent enough to design a universe with these exquisite numbers. Now we have three lines of evidence that are resulting in the same basic conclusion. We have an immaterial mind at work in the world. That's just what all men call God. I want to appeal to one more line of evidence, and that would be the beginning of the universe. This is most famously put together in what they call the Kalam cosmological argument. William Lane Craig is the most famous proponent of this argument today. He kind of revitalized it back in the 70s, I believe. And it goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore it has a cause. And then whenever you look at the qualities of what would cause a universe, this would be very similar to what we call God. Now, let's go through each of these premises. How would an atheist deal with this? Because it would lead to something like God. They can reject the first premise, which seems to be insane, because we've known since Lucretius and Parmenides that nothing comes from nothing, or to quote a more, let's say, credible philosophical source, Maria von Trapp.
Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could.
And let me see if I can just put this another way, because sometimes the word nothing gets used as a noun. So it leads to some conflation and confusion we're going to see here in a minute. Let me just rephrase it. Existing things cannot arise uncaused out of non-existence. That's what we mean. So for the atheist who wants to reject the first premise to avoid the conclusion, they're in the unenviable position of believing that things can arise uncaused out of non-existence. Now, not only is this rooted in our really basic, fundamental metaphysical beliefs about the whole world. And by metaphysics, I don't mean space aliens and psychics. What I'm talking about is your meta or your beyond beliefs, your beliefs about the physical world itself. If you believe the physical world exists and it's not a figment of your imagination, that's a metaphysical belief. So it's grounded in metaphysical arguments, right? That non-existence has no properties. There's no properties of nothing, and therefore nothing can't produce anything like existence. It actually flies in the face to deny this, flies in the face of all scientific reasoning. Our every single experience for all of our lives is that when something begins to exist, it has a cause. It's the basis for criminology. It's the basis for forensic sciences. It's the basis for most scientific endeavors, or at least investigative scientific endeavors. Now, saying that every piece of evidence supports this claim is a whole that bears a lot of weight. So how do atheists respond to it? One of the brightest and I think most careful thinkers on the atheistic side is a young man named Alex O'Connor. He had a discussion with Bill Craig about this argument, and in order to undermine the first premise, he adopted a position called, I don't know if this is his position or if he's just simply saying it would undermine this premise. He adopts a thing called mereological nihilism. Now, this is a really radical view that composite things don't actually exist, that this microphone, the desk, me, and the chair, none of this actually exists independently. There's only one thing that exists, and that's the fundamental particles of the universe, whether that be quarks or strings or whatever. We may dig down even further. Whatever the fundamental physical thing is, that's all that exists, and these are just different shapes. There's no microphone. This is just quarks shaped in this way. And if that were the case, then you couldn't ever say the microphone came into existence, and therefore you couldn't then say, oh, well, everything that came into existence had a cause. That seems to me, again, an intellectual cost so high as to put atheism beyond reach. Or you can go with the patently self-contradictory idea of self-causation. This is what the 12th most quoted and cited philosopher, Daniel Dennett, goes to. He says that the universe, in the ultimate bootstrapping trick, pulled itself up and created itself out of nothing. Now, we've known since probably before, but at least as far back as Thomas Aquinas, that self-causation is literally illogical. Why is self-causation self-refuting? Let's explain. Let's assume that you started to exist at exactly midnight on Tuesday. Now, in order for you to create yourself, you would have to come into existence at some point before midnight on Tuesday in order to then create yourself so that you would begin to exist at midnight on Tuesday, which would mean that you'd have to exist before you existed. Hopefully, it doesn't require much more than simply to say it and then laugh at it. That's absurd. Finally, what atheists will do is they will appeal or not appeal, they will conflate the ideas of nothing. Lawrence Krauss, famous physicist, wrote an entire book doing exactly that and then was panned for doing exactly that. His book was titled A Universe from Nothing, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing, trying to answer Leibniz's age-old question. Of the book he was being interviewed, he said this: The religious question, why is there something rather than nothing, has been around since people have been around. And now we're actually reaching a point where science is beginning to address that question. Further, he says, what's amazing to me is that we are now at a point where we can plausibly argue that a universe full of stuff came from a very simple beginning, the simplest of beginnings, nothing. But then what he gave with his right hand, he takes back with his left. He says this, when asked by Anderson, your book argues that physics have definitively demonstrated how something can come from nothing. He responds by saying, I don't think I argued that physics has definitively shown how something can come from nothing. Physics has shown, listen to this word here, see how he's conflating some ideas, the idea of something and nothing. It has shown how plausible physical mechanisms might cause that to happen. Further, he says, even if you accept this argument that nothing is not nothing, nothing is not nothing, you have to acknowledge that nothing is being used in a philosophical sense. So you can see, in order to avoid this question, he's simply equivocating on what nothing means, and he says nothing is actually something. So what precisely is Krauss talking about when he talks about nothing? He explains here in this paragraph. He says, when I talk about empty space, I'm talking about a quantum vacuum. But when I'm talking about no space whatsoever, I don't see how you can call it the quantum vacuum. Now, here's where he explains. It's true that I'm applying the laws of quantum mechanics to it, meaning no space, but I'm applying it to nothing, to literally nothing. No space, no time, nothing. There may have been meta laws that created it, but how do you call that universe that didn't exist something is beyond me. Of course, it did exist because he's applying to it all those rules. Let me give you a quote about what Alexander Vilenkin says of the quantum vacuum. A vacuum is ordinarily thought of as empty space, but according to modern particle physics, what is empty is not nothing. The vacuum is a physical object endowed with energy density and pressure. It can be in a number of different states or vacua. The properties and types of elementary particles differ from one vacuum to another. Now, what Krauss is doing is he's taking all the properties of space, of empty space, and he's applying it to nothing. So all of a sudden, it can now do the things that empty space can do. Well, of course, that is a foolish assumption. And of course, he's equivocating on what nothing is. He's saying nothing has energy and density and all these other sorts of things. If I say I have nothing good to say about Krauss's book, and then go on to acclaim how wonderful it is, and it's so well written, and it's scientifically valid, you would see immediately the contradiction in those two terms. Now, that thought experiment took us a sum total of 3-4 seconds. It entirely dismisses and disproves all of Krauss's work. But Krauss isn't interested in that type of pushback because, as he says, I don't give a what nothing means to philosophers. Now let's move on to the second premise, that the universe began to exist. Why should we accept that scientific claim? From Einstein until now, we've been talking meaningfully about the origin of the universe. Alexander Friedman solved his equations, and in doing so, with one small caveat, showed that the universe had to have had a beginning in the past. Now, there were 1,001 theologians that came out and said, listen, that's just what we mean when we say God created the heavens and the earth. And the atheist contingent pushed strongly back against that. And because science had long held that the universe was itself eternal and didn't need a cause, they persisted in trying to create models that were consistent with relativity, but that also showed that we didn't need a beginning to the universe. Alexander Friedman is one of the most respected theoretical physicists around the world. He's worked in cosmology for over 25 years, and he's now the director of the Institute of Cosmology at Tufts University. And here's what he has to say about the evidence for the beginning of the universe. He says, quote, "The answer to the question, did the universe have a beginning, is it probably did. We have no viable models of an eternal universe." Earlier in 2012, he said, quote, "All the evidence we have says the universe had a beginning." You don't have to be a physicist to understand that statement. Now, without getting too into the nitty-gritty, let me give you a couple of the discoveries and a couple of the reasons why he holds that position. First, he's the V in what we call the BGV theorem. And the BGV theorem, he summarizes like this. Loosely speaking, our theorem states that if the universe is, on average, expanding, then its history cannot be indefinitely continued into the past. The vast majority of the models that seek to avoid the beginning of the universe fall victim to the BGV theorem, meaning that they include an average expansion rate of the universe, which would imply in the back in the history of that said universe or that said model, it can't be eternal. There are a few other models that are proposed, but they fall victim to other well-established and non-controversial problems. So, for example, if you believe in the cyclic model, that the universe bangs and then contracts and then bangs and crunches over and over again, the problem with that is that entropy is preserved through each of these crunches, which would mean that if it had been going on forever, then by now we should have a universe in which we've reached the maximum amount of entropy. There's a way to avoid that, which was posited by a couple of physicists about a decade ago. But the problem there is that the way they avoided the entropy problem was that the universe continued to expand with each cycle, which would mean on average it's expanding, which again falls victim to the BGV theorem. George Ellis, one of the more famous cosmologists in the world, showed that if the universe existed eternally as a sort of a quantum state, totally static, then it could exist eternally that way, and then 14 billion years ago erupted into the Big Bang. And the problem with that one is that while Ellis proposes it as a proof of concept that doesn't fall victim to the BGV theorem, it's not in any way realistic, because what we know of quantum states is that they're inherently unstable, and therefore they would have given over to quantum collapse long before eternity had passed by. And that's, of course, to say nothing of the mathematical and the logical challenges to these things. We know a whole lot about infinity because of a branch of mathematics called set theory. And there are some rules, what they call axioms to set theory, that are just about arbitrary. And what I mean by that is, let me give you an example. You're not allowed to subtract two infinite sets whenever you're doing mathematics set theory. And here's why. Because you can start with two of the same numbers on the left side of the equation, and it results in contradictory answers on the right side of the equation. So let me give you an example. Imagine I have a set of all natural numbers, and then I subtract from it all of my even numbers. Okay, and I've subtracted an infinite number of numbers. And subtracting even is infinite. And then how many do I have left over? I have all my odd numbers. That's also infinite. So I would have an infinity minus an infinity equals an infinity. Now I could do the exact same thing where I say I have all the natural numbers. And then this time, instead of subtracting my even numbers, I'll subtract every number above 2. And then what do I have left over? What's my answer? I have infinity minus infinity equals 2. Well, I could then do it again and say all the natural numbers minus all the natural numbers, and what do I get? I get 0. So I've got the same equation, but I've got 3 different contradictory answers. Now, that's why you're not allowed to, in set theory, subtract. But if the past was eternal, then you'd have an actual infinite set. In reality, we should adopt the idea that reality can't contain contradictions. Now, there's nothing that would keep you from subtracting in the real world. So if you had an actual infinite in the real world, then you could subtract from it, you would get contradictory answers. Therefore, in reality, you can't have an actually infinite set. But of course, if we had an infinite past, we would have an actually infinite set, which means that the past itself cannot be eternal. Now, some atheists have looked at what I just said, and they would deny that reality can't contain contradictions. There's a very famous thought experiment called Hilbert's Hotel that illustrates this perfectly. And some atheists have simply looked at Hilbert's Hotel and said, yes, it leads to contradictory answers, absurdities, but that's just what reality is like. Reality, if it contains infinite sets, contains absurdities. And instead of saying what I said, well, it can't possibly because reality can't be absurd or contradictory, they've simply endorsed that. So let's go to the implications of atheism and let's refresh. You can maintain your naturalism by accepting the logically incoherent idea of self-causation, the metaphysically absurd idea of mereological nihilism. You can be intellectually bankrupt and just simply equivocate on the meaning of nothing, treating non-existence as though it has all the properties of existence. Or you can accept that reality can contain, in fact, contradictions. But of course, if it can contain contradictions, then it could be true that God exists and doesn't exist. Both of those statements could be true. That's nonsense. So here's your intellectual cost. There's one more. There's a fifth one posed by Daniel Dennett. This is called naturalism of the gaps. A lot of times Christians are accused of positing God to fill up a gap in our knowledge. Here's what Daniel Dennett says. He listened to the presentation by Bill Craig on the Kalam cosmological argument. He praised both of the premises as being seemingly obviously true. He then praised him for having defended the premises with fantastic arguments. So you may think, well, if it's a deductive argument, then what are we missing here? 2 true premises with solid evidence backing them up and a logically valid conclusion would guarantee the conclusion. Here's what he says. And you can go find this on YouTube. It's just called Daniel Dennett on William Lane Craig. And he says that if the conclusion is so absurd that you simply can't accept it, then you can just hope against hope that these obviously true premises will be overturned by some scientific discovery in the future that will overturn what Lincoln says is all of our scientific evidence about the universe, and against the obvious first premise that whatever begins to exist had some sort of antecedent cause. Or you can simply go with our repeated experience, go with all the science, and say the universe did have a cause, and then reflect on what that kind of cause would be. It would be outside of space and time, as it's the cause of space and time. It's outside of and beyond material because it made material. It is likely a person. And why is that? There are only two kinds of causes. There are personal and impersonal causes. The problem with an impersonal cause is that it's always a physical thing. It's always gravity. It's a law of nature, or it's something inside of nature. But we just saw that the cause of all of the universe is itself beyond the material universe. Therefore, it is not one of these types of things. So it must be the only option left is a personal cause. The concept of being beyond space and matter is completely consistent with what we call a spirit, and being a mind is certainly consistent with that as well. Being beyond time is literally one of the biblical definitions for being eternal. See Jude 1:25. It's powerful enough to create all of space, time, matter, energy. It's intelligent enough to design it by with the fine tuning that we found earlier in the arguments. It is the necessary personal ground of all moral values and virtues and duties. And if the creator and the designer of the universe is this immaterial mind, that would make a whole lot of sense as to why you would find other smaller immaterial minds within creation as well. And of course, an eternal, immaterial, spiritual being that is the grounding for all of moral duties, values. It is the cause and the similitude for the immaterial minds that we find in humans. Well, that's just the entity that we have always called God. Now, the existence of God is rejected by some simply because it is deeply scary for them. There are implications. If God exists, there are implications on a whole other host of areas of life that they've never really considered or opened themselves up to. It has implications on your ethics, on your time, on your money, on your, God forbid, sex life, right? And for many, the implications of God's existence are so high that they would rather accept all those absurd conclusions that we just talked about. So here I propose to you a dichotomy. Either accept all the common sense understanding that we have of the universe, which would imply God's existence, and therefore accept the implications of that on your personal life, or out of fear of these personal implications, reject God's existence and accept that you will never be able to actually make sense of the world. That's it. We're done. Unsafe Media. We're all listener supported. Linktree in the description if you want to support. My name is Ryan Martin, reminding you until next time, trust God, keep your powder dry.